Marguerite Anne Colworth did not scream. She did not weep. She did not reach for the arm of the chair beside her, though her knees had gone strange and distant, as if they belonged to someone standing in another room. She set down the cup she had been holding, set it down with both hands, slowly, so that it would not rattle in its saucer, and she watched the Duke of Renwick draw a single black line through her name in the Marholt family Bible. The ink was still wet. She could see it catch the candlelight. Beneath the crossed line, in the same hand that had written it 11 months before at her wedding, the words remained legible. Marguerite Anne, M. Gideon Edmund, 3rd Duke, legible, and struck through, the way a debt is struck through in a ledger once it has been called unrecoverable. She rose. She drew the ring from her finger, the plain gold band, not the showpiece with the Renwick sapphire, only the one that had meant something, and she laid it, without a word, in the centre of the open page, on the wet ink, where it would leave a small clean circle once the ink dried around it. Then she walked out of the long gallery of Renwick Hall, past 40 guests who did not know where to look, and out into the June evening, and she did not look back once. By morning she would be gone from the house entirely. It would take the Duke the better part of a year to understand what he had just struck out. The spring before that had come to the county the way it always did, heavy and green, and entirely indifferent to the people living inside it. Marguerite had been married to Gideon Marholt for 11 months by the time the apple blossom came in, and in that time she had learned the exact weight of the Renwick account books, the precise temper of the North Tenant farms, and the particular silence of a husband who spoke to her most easily through the medium of figures. It had not always seemed like coldness. In the first weeks she had told herself it was reserve, the kind bred into men who had inherited too young and buried too many relations too fast. He was not unkind to her. He simply managed her, the way he managed the home farm and the drainage on the low meadow, competently, attentively, and entirely without warmth, as though she were one more asset that required regular inspection to remain in good order. She had made herself useful because it was the only door left open to her. She kept the household accounts with a precision that made the steward blink. She corrected an error in the tenant rent rolls that had gone uncaught for 6 years. She wrote letters in a hand so clear the solicitor in Marlstow kept one framed as an example of legibility. None of it made Gideon look at her the way she had hoped, in that private and foolish way brides hope, when the marriage had first been arranged between their fathers. It only made him rely on her, which she had come, slowly to mistake for something warmer than it was. She had lost a child in the winter early, before it could properly be called a loss to anyone but her. Gideon had said, when she told him only, "I am sorry for it," in the flat voice he used for weather and for debts, and then he had gone to see about a fence. That was the shape of her marriage, invisible labour, invisible grief, and a husband who thanked her the way a man thanks a good clerk. She had not known, in April, that a cousin named Aldous Penrose had begun quietly rebuilding his case to inherit Renwick, a case that required, at its foundation, that her marriage be shown unsuitable, her blood insufficiently certain, her father's estate insufficiently clean. She had not known that Penrose had found, or manufactured, letters suggesting her late father had died owing sums he had never owed. She had not known that the old Duke, Gideon's father, had once done precisely this to Gideon's own mother, struck her name from the same Bible, on the same page, for the same accusation of unsuitability, and that Gideon had grown up believing this was simply what a Marholt did when a wife proved uncertain. She did not know any of it on the morning of the 14th of June, when she dressed for the christening of Penrose's newborn son, and drove with her husband to the church at Milestone in a silence she had, by then, stopped noticing as strange. She would know all of it by nightfall. The church at Milestone was full for the christening. The county liked an excuse to gather. And a Marholt heir presumptive son was excuse enough, and it was there, in the vestry afterward, over cake and Madeira, that Aldous Penrose made his opening move with the particular gentleness of a man twisting a blade slowly so it would not be felt until it was already in. "Cousin," he said to Gideon, "you'll forgive me raising it today, of all days. But a father thinks of these things at a christening." Lineage, certainty, he smiled at Marguerite over the rim of his glass, warm as poured cream. "I had a letter last week, from a Mr. Aldrich who once handled your late father's affairs, Duchess. He mentions debts. Substantial ones. Settled, he suggests, rather conveniently, at the time of your marriage." "My father left no debts," Marguerite said. "I kept his books myself in his last year." "Then you will not mind the matter being looked into," Penrose said. "For the family's peace." She minded very much, and said so, evenly, and watched the room recalibrate around the accusation, the way a scale tips before anyone has added the second weight. It was the dowager who called for the Bible. Old Lady Marholt had never liked her, had never troubled to hide it, and she produced the family volume from the vestry cupboard with the ceremony of a woman producing evidence, and set it open upon the table. A Marholt wife must be certain, the dowager said, in the flat recitation of a doctrine, repeated so many times it no longer needed thought, or she is not a Marholt wife at all. "Your own father said it, Gideon, of your own mother. God rest her wherever she has got to." Marguerite looked at her husband. She watched him not defend her. She watched him look, instead, at the letter in Penrose's hand, and at his father's old law written into his marrow, and she watched him take up the pen the dowager offered him, because it was easier, in that moment, to believe an old certainty than a new woman. He did not say the words aloud. He did not need to. The line he drew said them for him. She did not scream. She did not weep. She set down her cup. Marguerite left Renwick Hall before dawn, with one trunk, her father's small annuity of £40, and the clothes that were unquestionably hers. She allowed herself exactly 20 minutes in the carriage to grieve, she had learned, over 11 months of a marriage that gave her nothing to hold. To ration her grief the way she rationed candles, because grief unrationed burned through everything and left nothing to build with, and at the end of the 20 minutes she took out her father's old accounts book, blank since his death, and opened it to the first page, and wrote at the top, in a hand steadier than she had any right to, "What is mine?" Under it she wrote, "My name, my competence, my father's cottage at Fernhollow, unencumbered, £40 a year, my composure." She did not write his name anywhere on the page. The cottage at Fernhollow had stood empty since her father's death, 4 miles from Milestone, a modest stone house with a leaking roof and 11 acres let to a tenant who had not paid rent in 2 years, because no one had troubled to ask him for it. It was here that Marguerite arrived at first light, and it was here that she met, within the hour, the woman who would become the first person, in a very long time, to look at her and see something other than an arrangement. "You'll be the Colworth girl," said the woman at the gate, arms folded, grey hair escaping a cap that had given up pretending to contain it. "Prue Hallett. I kept house for your father the last 2 years of his life, when nobody else would trouble to, and I've kept an eye on this place since, out of habit more than payment." Her eyes went over the trunk, the travelling dress, the bare hand where a ring should have been, and added it up the way a woman adds up a market stall before she's finished walking past it. "You've left him, then. He struck my name from the Bible," Marguerite said. "I did not so much leave as observe that I had already been removed." "Mrs." Hallett was quiet a moment. Then, "Well, you'll want the kettle on before you want sympathy, in my experience. Come in." It was, Marguerite would think later, the truest kindness anyone had offered her in 11 months, not comfort, but a kettle, and the assumption that she was capable of drinking from it without being managed through the process. She did not stay idle. Grief rationed was grief that left room for work, and there was a great deal of work at Fernhollow that no one had done in years. The tenant, a heavy, evasive man named Josiah Rudd, had been paying nothing and claiming poor harvests to anyone who asked. And on her second morning, Marguerite walked his 11 acres with her father's old accounts book under her arm, and found, within an hour, that Rudd's poor harvests bore no relation whatsoever to the state of his fields, which were well drained, well manured, and entirely capable of the yield he swore they could not produce. "Mr. Rudd," she said, "you have paid no rent in 2 years on the claim of failed crops. Your barley stand alone will bring £11 this autumn at current prices. I have counted the stooks from the lane, 3 separate mornings, so that you needn't take my word for it, you may count them yourself." Rudd went red, then careful. A widow's daughter, counting a man's barley from a public lane. That's a strange occupation for a duchess. "I am not a duchess today," Marguerite said. "I am a landlord with an unpaid tenant. The 2 positions require different manners, but the same arithmetic." He paid, in the end, not everything owed, but enough, and on a schedule she wrote out herself and had him sign, with old Tam Fenner, the parish's most respected small farmer, standing witness because his word was worth more in that country than any solicitor's seal. It was a small victory. It bought a new section of roof and 6 months of proper flour. But word of it moved through Marlstow the way water moves downhill, finding every low place, and within a fortnight 3 more struggling tenants along the Fernhollow lane had asked, carefully, whether the Colworth woman might look over their accounts as well. She did not charge for it. She only asked that they pay her, when they could, in honesty rather than excuses, and found that honesty, once asked for plainly, was surprisingly often given. It was Tam Fenner who first mentioned, over a fence in July, that the Duke had been asking after her. "Not to your face, mind," he said, working a nail loose from a rail with the flat of his thumb. "Asks Hallett's nephew, casual-like, how the Fernhollow place gets on. Asks it 3 times now." A man doesn't ask 3 times about a matter he's indifferent to. A man who has struck a name from a Bible is not entitled to curiosity about the woman he struck it from, Marguerite said, and went back to her ledger, and did not let herself think about it again until nearly dark. By September the fields along Fernhollow Lane were the tidiest in the parish, and Marguerite Colworth, she had stopped, without deciding to, calling herself by the other name, had begun keeping accounts for 6 households besides her own, and had converted Josiah Rudd from a man who avoided her on the lane to one who touched his hat to her and meant it. She had not converted her husband. She had not tried. But it was that same September that brought Gideon Marholt down the Fernhollow Lane himself, on horseback, alone, without an appointment or an apology prepared, and stopped at her gate the way a man stops at a door he is not certain will open to him. He did not come inside. He stood at the gate with his hat in both hands. She noticed the hands. She had learned, over 11 months, to read a great deal in his hands, since he gave away almost nothing else, and he said, "I am told you've straightened Rudd's accounts." And the Averys, and old Miss Coutts, who hasn't let anyone near her books in a decade. "You are well informed for a man who does not speak to me," Marguerite said. "I have not known how," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see that in the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes and cannot avoid. "I struck your name from a book my father struck my mother's name from. In the same room, for the same accusation, and I have spent every day since trying to decide whether that makes me my father, or only a man who was too frightened to think for himself in the moment it mattered." "Which is it?" she asked. He did not answer. He put his hat back on and rode away, and left her standing at the gate with the particular ache of a question asked honestly, and left, for now, unanswered, which she found, to her own surprise, harder to be angry at than his silence had ever been. The wound behind his coldness had a name, and Marguerite learned it not from Gideon, but from Mrs. Hallett, who had it from a housemaid, who had it from the old butler at Renwick, in the way that every true fact in a county eventually arrives at every door if you leave the door open long enough. Isabel Marholt, the old Duke's wife and Gideon's mother, had been struck from the family Bible when Gideon was 7 years old, on an accusation, never proven, never disproven, simply declared that her family's fortune had been misrepresented at the marriage settlement. She had left Renwick within the month. She had never written. Gideon had grown up being told, by a father who believed it devoutly, that a Marholt wife who proved uncertain was not merely unfortunate but dangerous, a hole a man could pour his whole life into and lose it, and that the only safety lay in never trusting a woman's account of herself further than her documents could prove it. "He doesn't hate you, Mrs., Hallett said, setting down 2 cups with more force than the tea required. "He's spent 20 years being taught that loving a wife who might leave is the one mistake a Marholt man can't survive. It isn't an excuse. A grown man can choose better than the child he was taught to be. But it explains the shape of the thing." Marguerite turned this over for several days, the way she turned over a set of accounts that did not yet balance, looking for where the error had entered. "Explained is not forgiven," she said finally, to no one, to the empty kitchen, and went back to her ledgers. Aldous Penrose, meanwhile, had not been idle either, having failed to have the marriage's legitimacy questioned outright. He turned his attention to the debt letters, and produced, in early October, a second document, a sworn note, purportedly signed by Marguerite's late father, acknowledging an obligation of £300 to a moneylender in Portsmouth, a debt Penrose suggested had been quietly discharged from Renwick's coffers at the time of the marriage, in exchange for the match itself. It was. Marguerite recognised the moment she was shown it by a horrified Tam Fenner, who had ridden to Fernhollow the instant he heard it read aloud at the Marlstow Assembly Rooms. A forgery. Competent, but a forgery. Her father's hand did not loop his lowercase g that way. She had 400 of his letters in a trunk upstairs to prove it. The county, hearing only the accusation and not yet the defence, began to speak of her the way a tide begins to turn, before anyone standing on the shore has noticed the water is now moving the other direction. Not all at once, but in 100 small realignments. Miss Coutts, whose books she had straightened, said loudly at the milliner's that she'd trust the Colworth girl's arithmetic over any Portsmouth moneylender's signature. Tam Fenner said, to anyone who'd listen, that he'd stood witness to Rudd's rent schedule and never met a straighter woman. It was not proof. It was reputation, compounding, the way interest compounds, slowly and then all at once. It was not enough yet to answer Penrose's forgery with reputation alone. Marguerite understood that. Reputation persuaded a parish. Only paper would persuade a magistrate. She began, that October, to look for her father's will in earnest, not the copy she had, which was silent on any Portsmouth debt, but the original, filed she believed with a Chichester solicitor her father had trusted, and never named to her directly, for reasons she was only now beginning to suspect. The rival, when she came, arrived at Renwick with a fortune of £40,000, and a father eager to see it married into a dukedom, and her name was Cecilia Vane. Marguerite heard of her the way she heard most Renwick news now, second-hand over a fence or a counter, and she felt, hearing it, not the jealousy she might have expected, but a kind of grim recognition, the way one tradesman recognises a competitor's ledger trick. Penrose had engineered the introduction, of course, a bride with a fortune large enough to make an annulment worth the scandal, and a father ambitious enough not to ask too many questions about why the current Duchess had left the house with her ring on an open page. She learned the rest of it in November, when Miss Vane herself, unannounced and travel-stained, arrived at the Fernhollow gate in a hired gig, and asked, without preamble, to speak with her. "I did not come to gloat," Cecilia Vane said, before Marguerite could decide what expression to arrange for her face. "I came because I cannot sleep, and because your cousin Penrose has told my father 3 different stories about why your marriage is void, and none of them agree with each other, and I am not so great a fool as my father hopes I am." "Sit down," Marguerite said, surprising herself, and put the kettle on. It was Cecilia who told her, over tea neither of them drank, that Penrose had shown her father a letter, the 3rd document now, beyond the debt note and the lineage rumour, purporting to be a private confession from Marguerite herself, admitting the marriage had been a financial arrangement from the start. Cecilia had read it twice. "The hand does not tremble anywhere it ought to," she said. "I have read 100 letters written under duress in novels my mother disapproves of. This was not one. It was too neat. You would give up £40,000 and a dukedom over a badly forged letter," Marguerite said slowly. "I would give up a marriage to a man who does not want me, to a family that would use me as a lever against a woman who has done nothing but manage figures competently, while sad men make foolish choices around her," Cecilia said. "My father can find another duke. I would rather find my own life." It was, Marguerite thought later, the first entirely honest thing anyone connected to Renwick had said to her in a year. Gideon came again the following week, this time past the gate and into the small front room, and this time he did not stand with his hat in both hands, but sat, badly, on the edge of a chair too small for the length of him, and said the thing he had evidently been building towards since September. "Penrose has shown Vane's father a letter he claims is yours," he said. "I do not believe it is yours. I have not believed it since the hour I saw it, and I have said so to my aunt and to Vane's father, and I am telling you now because I should have told you first, and did not. Because I have spent a year deciding it was safer to doubt everyone equally than to trust anyone specifically. That is not a strategy," Marguerite said. "That is a wound wearing the costume of a policy." He absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he has been expecting. "Yes," he said. "It is. What do you want, Gideon?" "I want to undo a line I drew in ink I cannot unmake," he said, I know that is not possible. I am not asking for the impossible. I am asking what would be possible, if anything is. She did not answer him at once. She let the silence sit, the way she had learned to let silences sit rather than fill them out of habit, and when she spoke it was with the flatness of a woman reading terms rather than feelings. "Show me," she said. "Not tonight, not with a speech, however well meant. Show me over time, in ordinary days, doing the unwitnessed work of trusting me before you are asked to. If you can do that, we will speak again. If you cannot, I will have lost nothing I have not already survived losing." He nodded once and stood, and at the door he stopped and drew something from his coat. Not the ring. She had not expected the ring, not yet. But a small, cracked miniature portrait she recognized after a moment as his mother's, Isabel's, the only likeness of her that had survived his father's purge of the house. "I found this in a drawer no one has opened in 20 years, he said. The room it was locked in was hers. My father sealed it the week she left and never spoke of her again. I opened it last month for the first time since I was 7. He set the miniature on her table, gently, as though it might still bruise. "I am not giving it to you to be forgiven. I am giving it to you because you are the only person I know who might understand what it costs to open a locked room." He left before she could answer, which she thought afterward was itself a kind of answer. A man leaving before he could ask to be thanked for a difficult thing done rightly. The document that rewrote everything arrived in December, and it arrived, fittingly, in her father's own hand. Marguerite found the Chichester solicitor, a precise, unhurried man named Mr. Ezra Coates, through the simple expedient of writing to every solicitor's office within 20 miles, whose name she recognized from her father's old correspondence, and on her 3rd letter received a reply requesting her presence at his office at her earliest convenience, regarding a sealed deposit made by the late Josiah Colworth some 6 years prior. The deposit was a trust, small but entire, £1,100 set aside in Marguerite's name alone, entailed to her regardless of marriage, established the same year her father had first heard whispers that the Marholt family drove hard bargains with brides who came to them without independent means. Attached to it, in her father's clear, patient hand, was a letter. "My dear girl, it read, if you are reading this, either I am gone before my time, or you have found reason to need what is yours and no one else's. I never told you of this because I did not want you to marry with one eye on an escape, and thereby fail to give the marriage its honest chance. But I did not raise a daughter to have no ground of her own to stand on, whatever ground her husband might or might not offer her. Whatever they tell you about what you owe them, know first what is owed to you. There had never been a debt to any Portsmouth moneylender. There had never been a settlement, quiet or otherwise, purchased with her father's obligations. The debt note was, as she had known, a forgery, and now she had, in her father's own untraceable hand, and Mr. Coates's careful witness, the proof that her father's true papers had never once mentioned such a sum, in 6 years of meticulous accounts Coates himself had kept in trust. "There is one thing more," Coates said, as she made to leave, and produced a second letter, older, its seal already broken. "Your father asked me, some years back, to make discreet inquiry after a similar matter concerning a lady of the Marholt family. I did not connect the two commissions until your visit today. I believe your father and the former Duchess Isabel were, before her marriage, known to each other, cousins by a mother's side, distant, but real. He kept an interest in what became of her, after. Inside was a letter from Isabel Marholt herself, written the year she left Renwick, entrusted to a Colworth cousin she trusted more than any Marholt, asking that it be kept until it could do some good, addressed to whichever future Duchess of Renwick might one day need to know that she had not run from a debt or a scandal, but from a doctrine, and that the doctrine had been wrong then, and would be wrong again. Marguerite read it twice in the solicitor's cold little office, and did not ration the tears that came with the second reading, because for once they were not grief she needed to survive, but grief she had finally been given permission to feel in full. Penrose's final counterpunch came 3 days later, and it very nearly worked. He produced, before the assembled Marholt solicitors and Cecilia Vane's father, a sworn affidavit from a Portsmouth clerk attesting under oath to the existence of the original debt, complete with a ledger entry he claimed to have copied from a moneylender's book, long since burned in a warehouse fire. Convenient, unfalsifiable, and delivered with the smooth, warm confidence of a man who had learned that confidence itself persuades better than evidence. Marguerite received word of the affidavit at Fernhollow on a wet Tuesday, and read it through twice without her hands shaking, which she noted, with the same dispassionate interest she gave any other fact, as evidence of how much steadier a year of work had made her. "He has overreached," she said to Mrs. Hallett. "A man does not burn a ledger and then swear to its contents in the same breath, unless he has never once had to defend a document in front of someone who understands documents." "You sound almost fond of the wretch, Mrs." Hallett said. "I am fond of the mistake," Marguerite said. "Not the man. The Marlstow Harvest Assembly was, by long custom, the one occasion in the year when the whole parish gathered under a single roof without regard to rank, tenant and gentry, tradesman and magistrate, all crowded into the long hall to settle accounts, hear disputes, and watch the county's business conducted in the open, where everyone could see it done. It was Mr. Coates who suggested it as the venue, on the grounds that a matter this public required a resolution this public, and it was Marguerite who agreed, because she had learned over a long year that documents alone rarely turned a room turned when it watched the truth arrive, in person, unbidden. She stood at the front of the hall on the last Thursday of January, in a plain grey dress, with no ornament but her father's small mourning brooch, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned that a lowered voice in a silent room carries further than a shout ever could. "I am accused," she said, "of a debt my father never owed, settled with money that was never spent, in exchange for a marriage that was never a bargain of that kind. I have here my father's true and complete accounts for the 6 years preceding his death, kept and witnessed by Mr. Ezra Coates of Chichester, showing no such obligation existing at any point." She laid the ledger on the long table. "I have here the trust my father established in my name alone, 6 years before his death, which any honest reading will show he would not have troubled to create had a debt of this size been hanging over his estate at the time." Penrose, from the second row, said, smooth as ever, "Documents can be prepared after the fact by any competent hand, Duchess, they can," Marguerite agreed. "Which is why I did not bring only documents." She turned toward the door. "Mr. Coates, if you would." Mr. Coates rose and gave his account, precise and unhurried, of the trust's true date of establishment, verified by his own office's uninterrupted records. Then old Tam Fenner rose, unasked, hat in his 2 hands, and said that he had known Josiah Colworth 20 years and never once heard him mention Portsmouth in any connection but a horse fair. Then Miss Coote rose, and Mrs. Averies, and 3 more of Marguerite's small clients, none of them summoned, all of them simply present, as the parish always was, and each added some small unbidden fact that on its own proved nothing, and together proved a great deal, the way 100 small stitches together make a coat that will hold against weather. Then the Portsmouth clerk's affidavit was read aloud in full, and Mr. Coates asked, gently, precisely, might we know the name of the warehouse, and the date of the fire, so that the parish register of the event might be consulted? There was no warehouse. There had been no fire. The clerk, produced under questioning to have never set foot in Portsmouth in the year in question, folded within a minute of honest cross-examination. And something behind Aldous Penrose's composure, the warm, poured cream ease that had carried him through a year of careful lying, went out like a snuffed candle, all at once, in front of the whole assembled parish. Marguerite watched the room turn the rest of the way a tide turns fully once the current has already been running against the shore for an hour unnoticed. She watched faces that had looked at her with pity 6 months before look at her now with something closer to respect, which she found she wanted rather less than she had once imagined, and needed rather more. She had the mercy ready, and she gave it because she had decided, weeks before, that she would rather be the kind of woman who could have destroyed a man and chose not to than the kind who simply could not. Mr. Penrose, she said, I will not pursue a charge of fraud against you, on the condition that you resign any further claim upon the Renwick succession, in writing, before this assembly, today. You will not be ruined. You will simply no longer be believed, which I think you will find, in a county this size, is very nearly the same thing, and rather less than you deserve, and rather more mercy than you offered me. He signed. His hand, she noted, trembled rather more than her father's ever had over a genuine debt. Gideon had not spoken through the whole of it. He rose now, in front of the parish that had watched his wife dismantle a year of lies, with nothing but arithmetic and honest witnesses, and he did the one thing Marguerite had not asked him to do, and had, privately, wanted more than anything else in the hall. He walked to the front, and asked the parish clerk for the family Bible, which had been brought. Coates had thought to send for it, and he found the page, the crossed lines still faintly visible beneath a year of handling, and beneath it, in fresh ink, in front of everyone, he wrote her name again, whole, unstruck, and beneath that he wrote, restored, this 30th day of January, by my own hand, and my own error acknowledged before this parish. You are not what I bargained for, he had said to her once, in October, meaning it as an old family judgment repeated without thinking, a doctrine worn so smooth by use it had stopped feeling like a wound to the man delivering it. He said it again now, in front of the whole hall, and this time he finished it. You are not what I bargained for. You are what I would beg for, if begging were the coin you wanted. I understand it is not. I am prepared to pay in the other coin instead time and honesty, and work for as long as it takes. Marguerite did not answer him in the hall. There were things that belonged to a room full of witnesses, and things that belonged only to the two of them, and she had learned, this past year, exactly where that line fell. He came to Fernhollow 3 days later, and this time she let him sit at her table properly, with tea that got cold because neither of them drank it, and she told him, plainly, that an explanation and an apology were not the same instrument, and she required both, in full, before either of them spoke of anything further. The apology is simple, he said. I struck your name from a book, because a room full of frightened people told me to, and because I had been taught since I was 7 that a wife who could not be proven certain was a wife who could not be trusted, and I chose the doctrine over the woman standing in front of me, and that was a coward's choice dressed as prudence. I am sorry for it, without qualification. I will not ask you to consider the circumstances as mitigation. There is no mitigation for choosing not to defend you. That is the apology, Marguerite said. Now the explanation. He told her the rest of it slowly, his mother's leaving, his father's law, the 20 years of being taught that love offered without proof was a debt a man could not survive defaulting on. The particular arithmetic of a boy who had decided it was safer to withhold everything than to risk losing it twice. He did not excuse any of it. He simply laid it on the table between them the way she laid a ledger, so that she could see the whole account and judge it for herself. I understand the wound, she said, when he had finished. I do not accept it as a reason I should have been struck from a book in front of 40 guests. Explained is not the same as forgiven, but it is the beginning of forgiven, which is further than we were a week ago. What are your terms? He asked. I would rather know them plainly than guess, and fail you again by guessing wrong. She had them written already, in her father's old accounts book, under the heading What is Mine, and she read them to him without softening a word. Her name entered permanently, unstruck, with her own signature witnessing it this time, not only his. Her authority over the tenant accounts formalised in writing, not merely tolerated. Her work at Fernhollow continued, on her own terms, whether or not she returned to Renwick. No doctrine of certainty ever again invoked against her, or against any woman who married into the family after her, without her own voice heard first, and an apology, separately, owed to Cecilia Vane, who had been used as a lever in a scheme she had never asked to be part of. All right, he said, when she had finished. All right, then, she said, and that was the whole treaty. He went to Cecilia Vane himself the following week, and made the apology in full in front of her father, and Cecilia, who had already told her own father plainly that she would not be married to settle a stranger's feud, accepted it with the same dry composure Marguerite had come to recognise as the mark of a woman who had learned to survive being managed by other people's plans. She left Sussex that spring for an aunt in Bath, and wrote to Marguerite twice a year afterward. Letters that grew, over time, into something like friendship between two women who had each refused to be a leaver. Winter gave way, that year, to a wary spring, and the wariness itself was a kind of proof, because neither of them pretended the year before had not happened. The change came in ordinary days, in units so small the parish would never have thought to remark on any single one of them. Gideon began coming to Fernhollow twice a week, not to inspect but to work, mending the roof himself, badly at first, better with practice, because he had never in his life been permitted to do work with his hands, and found, at 30, that he liked it. He began pulling a second chair up beside hers, at the account table, without being asked, and sharing the ledger rather than reviewing it after the fact. He began pouring her tea before she reached for the pot herself, a small thing, meaningless in isolation, and Marguerite noted, privately, that it was the accumulation and not any single instance that had begun, slowly, to mean something. There was one relapse, in March, and she was glad of it, in a strange way, because it let her see how the correction would go. He made a decision alone, dismissed a dishonest under steward at Renwick, without consulting her, though the man's accounts touched the very tenant ledgers she now shared authority over, and told her of it afterward as a fact already settled. The old habit surfacing the way an old scar aches before rain. You did that the way you used to do everything, she said, evenly, alone, and after. He stopped. Started again. You're right. I am sorry. It will not happen again, and if it does, I would rather you tell me plainly than let it pass, because I would rather be corrected than comfortable. He did not do it again. In June, a year to the week since she had set her ring on an open page and walked out into the dark, Gideon came to Fernhollow in the evening, with no business pretext and no papers to review, and found her in the garden, and said, without any of the formality he had once used to armour himself, "I would choose you. I have been choosing you for some time now, in every ordinary day since January, though I understand a year of ordinary days is what was owed, and I have not finished paying it. I am not asking you to come back to Renwick tonight, or ever, unless it is a house you want to live in rather than a debt you are settling. I am only telling you the true state of my accounts, since you have taught me to keep them honestly." Marguerite looked at him a long moment, in the particular stillness of a woman deciding whether an offer is genuine or merely well phrased, and found, to her own quiet relief, that it was both. "I will come back," she said, "on my own terms, which you already hold in writing, and I will keep Fernhollow besides, because a woman ought to have ground of her own even inside a good marriage. And I would like my ring back, not the one I left on the page, a new one. That one belongs to the page now." He had, it turned out, already had one made. 2 years passed, quietly, the way good years do. Marguerite Marholt, Duchess of Renwick, kept the tenant accounts of both estates in a hand the whole county had come to trust more than any solicitors, and posted every Michaelmas a public ledger of fair wages paid to every labourer on Renwick land, the first estate in the county to do so, and within 3 years no longer the only one. Cecilia Vane married a Bath physician of her own choosing, and wrote, on the occasion, that she had never been happier to be entirely unremarkable to anyone but herself. Aldous Penrose lived out his years on a small allowance in Dorset, believed by no one who mattered, which he found, in the end, punishment enough. Old Tam Fenner taught 3 more seasons of tenants how to read a rent schedule before he died in his own bed, having asked, and been granted, a line in the parish register calling him what he had always in fact been, a man whose word could be trusted absolutely. The family Bible sat, as it always had, on the long table in the Renwick library, but it was opened now, deliberately, on the anniversary each June, to the page with the old crossed lines still faintly visible beneath the fresh ink of restoration, and the small clean ring of pale page where a gold band had once pressed into wet ink and left its mark for a year before anyone came to claim it. Gideon had had that mark framed under glass rather than let it fade, so that the page would carry both the wound and its answer forever, side by side, neither one erasing the other. The house at Renwick, callers remarked, had a different air to it than it once had, nothing anyone could quite name, only that the rooms no longer held their breath the way old houses sometimes do when something has gone wrong inside them and been left unspoken. It breathed now easily, the way a house breathes when the people inside it have stopped managing each other and started, instead, simply living. She had not asked in the end to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee, one ledger and one honest morning at a time, and that was not a thing any man's pen could strike from any page, no matter whose hand held it or what doctrine it was written to defend, not because she had waited to be chosen, but because she had first chosen herself, in a cottage with a leaking roof and £40 a year, when no one else in the county would have blamed her for choosing nothing at all, and a love that arrives only after a woman has proven she could have lived entirely without it, is not a lesser love for having arrived so late. It is, very often, the only kind that was ever going to last.